Great. and so there are a lot of us on the line, and it can feel it's easy to feel isolated. I know I am in a room staring at a wall, and so kind of as we listen on alone or at work or in our car on the phone. But let's really sit and imagine. Some of us might be lucky enough to be sitting around with our colleagues in a room, but let's imagine a room with all of the people on the call. And just realize that we're a community of people who are dedicated to taking bold steps to advance racial equity and to supporting each other as we try to cross the river by hopping from rock to rock. And today we are lucky enough to have three people who have put their hands out to help guide us and steady our path on this process. And so we have Andrew Scott from Portland, Oregon, and Andrew's the budget director for the city of Portland. And he's been working with Portland since 2002 as the financial planning manager, business operation manager, and financial analyst. And Andrew is really going to share with us how Portland is using their racial equity tool in their budgeting. We're also delighted to be joined and actually to even hear Jordan Bingham as well from Madison, Wisconsin, and she has over a decade of experience as a leader, educator, and facilitator in the areas of public health and racial justice. And now she's the health equity coordinator at Public Health Madison and Dane County, and is part of the leadership team for the City of Madison's Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiatives. And we'll get more to listen to her later, but they have been using their racial equity tool all over the place, and it's been kind of growing like a weed, so we're excited to hear from there. And then we're also excited to have Patricia Lally from Seattle, Washington, and she's the director of the City of Seattle's Office of Civil Rights. And the Office of Civil Rights enforces Seattle's anti-discrimination laws, conducts fair housing testing, and delivers progressive policy recommendations to city leaders. And Seattle really has been kind of the leader in all of this work. And so we're excited to see, because she's going to help us really identify kind of where the pitfalls are and where are the sticky points that we don't want to get into. And so I have been blessed to really be able to have kind of some pre-conversations with them. And so I'm excited to get this, to be able to share it with you and to have gotten a chance to be inspired by them. See if we can, that. Okay, great. So our goals for today is we want to gain an understanding of racial equity tools. We want to share examples of how racial equity tools have been used and explore the challenges that have come up and the lessons learned from the ways different jurisdictions have used them. And we want to get inspired by those ways. If there is something that you want to add to this agenda or a question that you want to make sure gets addressed, please write it in the chat box. And also today, we're going to try to run this a little bit differently. So we want to try to make it a little bit more of a conversation than strictly a PowerPoint presentation. And so this will be new for us, and it's a little bit of an experiment. But as one of our presenters, Jordan said in our pre-call, that we have to be willing to make mistakes in front of others. So, we're going to lead by example today with this. And so we're doing something a little bit different. And to help us do this, we would like you all to make sure that you are muted, because there might be times we're trying to open up everything to everybody, maybe, and to mute yourselves. And we're going to try out a couple of different kind of questioning techniques. So I believe that people have the ability to maybe raise your hands. There might be, no, we don't have that ability. Okay, I don't think that we have that ability. seem like it's working. So we'll try that. So that I think instead, we in the chat write yes. If you please write in the chat box yes if you are familiar with the GARE racial equity toolkit. On the meeting wall of this page, you'll find a link to the racial equity toolkit. But please give me a yes if you have already been using it, and if you are familiar with it. We're waiting. It looks like maybe 10% of us are aware. If you have been using it, please write a yes in the chat box. Okay, looks like we're about 10% of us are familiar with it. So we'll go over it a little bit more. Thank you. This has been helpful. I guess please also now in another one please write tool in the chat box if you are already using a racial equity tool. Please write tool in the chat box if you're already using the racial equity tool. And that will also give us a sense so that we can begin to put that together. It looks like about 10% of us are familiar with the racial equity toolkit. And so if we're not familiar with the racial equity toolkit, go to the meeting wall. The meeting wall has a link. It should say racial equity toolkit GARE, and you can look that up because that is a great resource. And we'll be introduced to a lot of it now. Okay, and it looks like only a couple of us have been trying out a racial equity tool so far. So only a few of us have. So most of us are interested in it, but still haven't yet gotten started. Okay, let's move on. So what is a racial equity tool? So the racial equity tools are designed to integrate explicit consideration of racial equity into decisions. And these can be any decisions. Could be policies, could be practices, could be programs, could be budgets. And it is, like we said, both a process and a product. And use of the racial equity tool can help to develop strategies and actions that reduce racial inequities and improve success for all groups. Okay? So too often we develop policies and programs without thoughtful consideration of racial equity, and the tool helps us stop and really bring it kind of explicitly into our operations and decision making. So as part of the process part of it, it helps us identify clear goals, objectives, and measurable outcomes. It helps us engage community in decision-making process, and it helps us identify who will benefit and or who will be burdened by a given decision, and helps us, gives us time to examine potential unintended consequences of that decision. As the part of it that is a product, it helps us develop strategies to advance racial equity and also helps us develop strategies that help mitigate any unintended consequences, any unintended negative consequences. And then it also helps develop mechanisms for successful implementation and evaluation of the impact. Okay. The racial equity tool is best used, we want to apply early, often, and by all. So the earlier we, in a decision-making process, we begin to apply the tool, the more effective it can be. When it's not left to the last minute, it means that we can really integrate our lessons into our plannings. So we want to apply it early. We want to apply it often. By applying it often, we can do it at multiple levels. And so, in fact, by doing so, will help increase our effectiveness. and by all. So a racial equity tool is a great tool for governmental staff. It's a tool that also can be used by elected officials, and it's a tool that can also be used by the community. And in fact, having all of these groups use it only reinforces and only helps us get to our final goal of a more equitable society, really. And so we want to use it early, often, and by all. I'm going to move on. So what exactly is the process? So although this slide might not seem so simple, it really is around asking 6 questions. Okay, so the first question is about our desired results. What is our proposal? So what is it that we want to do? And we could have a clear policy, program, practice, or budget decision. You know, as with everything, the clearer that we can be about it, the better it is for our outcomes. And then in our desired results, we also want to be vigilant about our focus on impact. And so in that, it's kind of a twofold prong. The results are the things at the community level that are the end conditions that we're aiming to impact. And the outcomes are at the jurisdiction, department, or program level. And the outcomes really look at A, the kind of quantity, how much did we do, B, how well did we do it, or the quality, and C, looking at, is anyone better off? And we want to maintain our focus on both those levels because only really by keeping our focus on the community level indicators, the results, are we actually making an impact on the society as we want to. But, you know, we're also the outcome measures help us look at what we are able to do. So at the end of this step, we should be able to answer questions like, we should be able to describe the policy, program, practice, or budget decision under consideration. We should be able to look at what are the intended results in the community and the outcomes within our organization. And we should be able to say what this proposal has the ability to impact. If it's health or housing, human services, children and youth, community engagement, economic development. All of those questions could be answered in that first piece. Then we move on to the data. And data is really an integral part of using our racial equity tool. So often data might be available, but it's not used to inform our strategies or track our results. And often the enormity of racial inequities can sometimes feel overwhelming. And so for us to impact the community, we must partner with others for cumulative impact. And it's necessary for government the work is necessary for us as government to do the work to advance racial equity, but it is not sufficient. And so we need to be aligned and clear so that we can increase our potential impact. And so we need data at multiple levels, the same levels actually that we talked about in our focus of results. We need to have data that clearly states the community indicators and the desired results, and data around our specific program and policy outcomes and performance measures. And in thinking about data, we not only want to look at quantitative data, but we also want to look at qualitative data. And we also want to acknowledge that sometimes missing data can speak to the fact that certain communities or issues or inequities have historically been overlooked. And sometimes data sets treat communities as a monolithic group without respect to subpopulations with differing social, economic, and cultural experiences. When we have completed this step, you should be able to answer these questions about your data. You should be able to answer, will the proposal have impacts in specific geographic areas? and what are the racial demographics of those living in that area. Should be able to answer, what does the population data tell you about your existing racial inequities, and what does it tell you about root causes or factors influencing the racial inequities? What performance level data do you have available for your proposal? And this should include any data associated with existing programs or policies. And you should also be able to answer, are there any data gaps? What additional data would be helpful in analyzing the proposal? And if so, if you have gaps, what are ways that you can obtain better data? The third piece is the community engagement piece. And so what we're trying to ask with community engagement is, how have communities been engaged, and are there opportunities to expand engagement? And in order for us to really tell who will be benefited or burdened by a proposal, we need to do more. We have to invite more people to the table. It can't just be an armchair exercise or exercise with us sitting around a table. We really have to begin to invite in the community members that are impacted. So involving communities impacted by a topic, engaging community throughout all the phases of a project, and maintaining clear and transparent communication as the policy or program is implemented will help us produce more racially equitable results. There are a couple of suggestions for really how do we engage communities, and this is going to be actually one of the topics that we'll talk about, that our presenters will talk about later on. But when we try to engage the community, when we're using smaller groups to feed into a larger process, it's important to be transparent about the recommendations or thoughts that came out of the small groups. So to have a list with a summary to really make sure that that we are sharing all the information. When we're using large group meetings to get more information, providing a mix of different ways for people to engage and interact. It could be with handheld voting devices. It could be in comments that you collect. It could be small groups, but to give in large groups many different ways for people to interact. And then we can also use trusted advocates and outreach engagement liaisons to collect information from communities that we know are typically unrepresented in public processes. When we are excuse me, when we are finished with this, we should be able to answer the following questions about community engagement and involving stakeholders. We should be able to answer, who are the most affected community members who are concerned with or have experience related to this proposal? How have you involved these community members in the development of the proposal? What has your engagement process told you about the burdens or benefits for these different groups? And what has your engagement process told you about the factors that produce or perpetuate racial inequity related to this proposal? Okay. So then the next pieces are about about analysis and strategies. And this step 4, gives us an opportunity to explicitly consider the unintended consequences so that impacts can be mitigated to the maximum extent possible. And so in here, we're going to assess our proposal and think about complementary strategies that would help us advance racial equity. The decisions that we're making, governmental decisions, are often complex and nuanced, right, with both intended and unintended impacts. And so this is a moment to just pull out what might be unintended from our proposal. And because racial inequities are perpetuated throughout systems and structures, it's also important to think about complementary approaches that will provide additional leverage to maximize the impact on the community. And so really expanding your proposal and your idea to integrate policy or program strategies and build broad partnerships will help increase the likelihood of community impact. When you've completed this step, you should be able to answer these questions. about your strategies. Given what you've learned from the data and the stakeholder involvement, how will the proposal increase or decrease racial equity? Who would benefit from or be burdened by your proposal? What are the potential unintended consequences? And what are the ways in which your proposal could be modified to enhance positive impacts or reduce negative impacts? You should also be able to answer the question like, are there any complementary strategies that you can implement? What are ways that existing partnerships could be strengthened to maximize impact on the community? How will you partner with stakeholders for long-term positive change? And then, are the impacts aligned with the original community outcomes as identified in step 1? And the next step is the implementation step. And it's just about what is your plan for implementation. And so in this, after the step, you should be able to describe your plan. You should be able to assess your plan. Is it realistic, adequately funded, adequately resourced with personnel, adequately resourced with mechanisms to ensure successful implementation and enforcement, adequately resourced to ensure ongoing data collection, public reporting, and community involvement. And then if the answer to any of those questions is no, what resources or actions are needed? And in the last step, how will you ensure accountability, communicate, and evaluate results? And so this is another step where we're really also going to use our data. Just as it was critical in analyzing the potential impacts, it will be important in seeing whether the program or policy has worked. Accountability entails putting processes, policies, and leadership in place to ensure that the program plans, evaluation recommendations, and actions leading to the identification and elimination of root causes of the inequities are actually implemented. And also put in communication, because how you communicate about your racial equity proposal is also important for your success. Poor communication about race can trigger implicit biases and perpetuate stereotypes, and oftentimes unintentionally. There are communication tools that we can use. The Center for Social Inclusion has a Talking About Race Right toolkit that can help develop messages and communication strategies. And then ultimately, our racial equity tools should be used on an ongoing basis. And we can also use it at different phases of a product. That should allow new opportunities for steps to advance racial equity to be identified and implemented. And often having iterative processes also allows us to go deeper. At the end of this piece, you should be able to answer the following questions. How will impacts be documented and evaluated? Are you achieving the anticipated outcomes? Are you having impact in the community? What are your messages and communication strategies that will help advance racial equity? How will you continue to partner and deepen relationships with communities to make sure that your work to advance racial equity is working and sustainable for the long haul? And so that is the process. It is both simple and deep. There is often the question, and I believe Jordan will speak to this more in a moment, but if we don't have enough time, what are we doing if we don't have enough time? And can we use this when we need to do quick turnaround? And so the key parts that we need to do if we need to do quick turnaround is to really look at what are the racial equity impacts of this particular decision, who will benefit from or be burdened by the particular decision, and are there strategies to mitigate the unintended consequences. I also want us to think about that when we have to do things, that sometimes taking a pause I guess, taking a pause is twofold in government. We don't want to pause so long that we never get anything done. That's not what we want to do. But sometimes taking a pause allows us to actually take a moment and allows us room to do things differently. And really having a focus on racial equity is something that we're doing differently. And so sometimes we need to have that pause. Now go on. So the racial equity, the use of the racial equity tool is an important step to operationalizing equity, but it is not sufficient by itself. It has to happen within a much broader vision of the transformation of government in order to achieve racial equity. And to transform government, we have to normalize conversations about race, and that means for us to have a shared analysis and a definition, for us to feel a sense of urgency and to prioritize these conversations and this work. We have to be wanting to operationalize new behaviors and policies, and so the racial equity tool is part of that is part of being able to operationalize it, as well as looking at data for strategies and results. And we also need to organize to achieve our racial equity. There are barriers that can come up while we're applying our tool. Some of the barriers are a lack of support from leadership, the tool being used in isolation, and a lack of support for implementing changes, and really striving for perfection, which can be an enemy of the good. And so all of those pieces, and we'll talk about, I think each of our presenters will talk in different ways about addressing these barriers, and we'll also probably bring up other barriers. But some of the ways that we can begin to address it is to build the capacity of our teams and build the capacity of racial equity teams. And training not only to cultivate skills for individual employees, but also to build the skill of teams to create support for group implementation and also to create a learning culture. We can systemize the use of the racial equity tool. If it's integrated into our routine operations, then we all will begin to acknowledge it as a priority. And also, if we integrate it, we'll just begin to become part of the way in which we do things. And then we also need to recognize and honor complexity. Most of our decisions, public policy decisions, are complex, and there are numerous pros and cons and trade-offs. And when we can use the racial equity tool over and over again in an iterative process, these complex nuances can be addressed over time. And then we want to maintain accountability. We want to build the expectation that managers and directors and staff, that we routinely use the use of the racial equity tool as part of the way in which we do business. Okay, so we are going to start with Andrew Scott, kind of in our pre-conversation, one of the things we talked about, I asked him, well, were you ready to start? And he was like, no, not really. And so we really are going to talk a little bit about both how he used it and how they're using it in budgeting in Portland, but we're also going to talk about just starting before you're ready and kind of jumping in. See, the water's fine, but you got to get fully wet. You can't just stick a toe. And Andrew, I think maybe you're unmuted. I am going to also see if I can give you control of the computer.
Great.
Andrew, if you can speak for me.
Well, I am here, and yeah.
Great. You are here. You do not yet have control, and I do not know why I cannot give you control like I was so able to do beforehand. Why am I not able to do this?
Well, let me, in the theme of this, let me go ahead and jump in, and then
Jump in, and I'll forward for you.
If you give me control, then I can take it, and otherwise I can just sort of let you know. No, and thanks. I'm really honored to be sort of part of this conversation and talk about where Portland is, and I think where we still need to go, because there's a lot of work to be done.
And just one more thing, I'm sorry, as we get into it. So if you all have questions, audience members, if you have questions while Andrew is talking, or if you had questions about the quick overview that I was able to give, just type them right into your question chat box, okay? All right, Andrew, there you go.
Great. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about sort of Portland's approach to equity and where we've been, and then really how we've been using a budget equity tool. But I think it's important to note in terms of the three cities you're going to hear from today, Portland, we really just are finalizing now our development of the comprehensive racial equity tool that Crystal's been talking about, and we're going to begin using that soon in the near future. But what we have been using, and it looks like maybe I have control, so I will.
You do have control.
Here. But what we have been using for a few years now is a budget equity and assessment tool. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how that came about and whether that's the right order to go in or not. During some of our pre-meetings, I think it's a great question, but I think that kind of gets to that theme of how we sort of jumped in on the budget side, and I think have seen some success and growth in the use of that tool, and now I think we're going to expand it into a more comprehensive racial equity tool. This first slide really just talks about the overall framework, a few years ago for equity in the city of Portland. And our city council adopted a Portland plan. This is a 20-year strategic plan for the city. And as part of that process, equity was a major focus. It actually became an overlay of the entire plan and all of the goals and strategies outlined in that plan. Around the same time, in 2011, well, maybe a little bit preceding adoption of the Portland plan, but the city created the Office of Equity and Human Rights. And so, again, another really, sort of building into our overall system and structure, an office that really, whose goal was to promote equity and reduce disparities within city government, along with some other goals as well. The Office of Equity and Human Rights convened the Citywide Equity Committee, which was a forum where people in the city could get together to discuss, the work that's going on around equity and how we could further it. And then finally, and I think really importantly, our mayor, Charlie Hales, made equity one of his major budget priorities throughout his term. And so you can see sort of his budget priorities there around, creating complete neighborhoods in the city, and then emergency preparedness, and then equity and opportunity. And I think that really elevated elevated the issue of equity in the minds of our bureaus, really seeing it from the top that, hey, this is something that our mayor is going to focus on as we go through the process. And so all of that set the groundwork for how we began to start incorporating equity into our budget process. And let me see if I can get to the next slide here. Maybe not. There we go. So there are three things we did in order to try and integrate equity, into budget. And one of those was we actually incorporated equity as a specific budget review criteria, and explicitly made it part of the criteria that the fiscal analysts in my office, which is the city budget office, that we use when we're making recommendations to the mayor and council about city programs. We also, and when I say we, the Office of Equity and Human Rights, created a budget equity assessment tool, which I'll talk about a little bit more as well, to make sure the bureaus were asking the right questions when they develop their budgets. And then finally, we started a project of mapping city spending and services by geography. And that helps give us a proxy for looking at how racial equity might be either helped or harmed by certain spending decisions, both current spending and how we may be able to change that going forward to hopefully make things better. So diving in on these, in terms of overall budget review criteria, what you'll see on this slide, and I've been doing public finance and budget for about 20 years now, and so you'll see that the first 11 of these are what you would consider your typical, very straightforward, frankly, pretty boring budget and finance criteria that you would expect budget analysts to use when reviewing a program. Supporting essential city services, maintaining infrastructure, identifying maintenance needs, et cetera. And what we actually did, so it used to be our top 11, and what we did is we added criteria number 12, which was to support the city's equity goals. And, we were able to tie that back into this approved strategic plan in the city, so there was a connection there in terms of why we were looking at this. But I'll tell you, this was not without controversy. Within the budget office. I think everyone in the city was in favor. I mean, again, it's part of our Portland plan. This groundwork had been laid. But what I ran into, and I will admit that even personally sort of had the same initial reaction, and then when I was rolling it out to my analysts, got some of that feedback as well. When I said, look, this is going to be one of our criteria, the response was, well, wait, why is this our job? We're budget analysts. We're in the budget office. This feels like it's the Office of Equity's job. I think I can honestly say no one was against using equity in terms of looking at these things, but they really didn't feel like it was something they should be doing. And I heard more than once, we're budget analysts. We're not equity analysts. And I think a lot of that discomfort was coming from the fact that they didn't have the training or background or confidence in terms of what does it even mean to support the city's equity goals. What does it mean to apply an equity lens to our recommendations? And, the question was, are we really the right people to be doing this, to applying the equity lens, or should it be done by someone else? And, along that theme of jumping in, we did jump in that first year. I will say I think we're a lot better at it now 4 years later than we were then. And one of the things we've done in the interim is made sure that we actually have done some training. So, I talked to the Office of Equity, brought them in. We did some budget 101, some equity 101 training. We had really open conversations, at our staff meetings about what this means. Really tried to make people feel comfortable about expressing what their concerns would be, so that we could also address it. And one of the arguments I used at the time was, 10 or 15 years ago, Portland's a pretty progressive city. 10 or 15 years ago, talking about sort of climate change or environmental sustainability was a little bit of an afterthought. And today, it's integrated into everything we do. And I don't think anybody, in terms of talking about budget decisions, would have an issue sort of raising that. If it brings us further along with our climate action plan or other, environmental sustainability goals, that had become incorporated. Equity hadn't. And I think that when we started putting in that framework of saying, that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to bring equity into the conversation so that it becomes ingrained in everything you do, in when you look at these programs and how you make your recommendations. I think that actually helped people begin to feel a little bit more comfortable. And then I will also say time helped. I think the analysts, the first year they did it, they felt very nervous. They felt very uncomfortable, particularly if they were making a recommendation and talking explicitly about the racial impact of that recommendation, or why they're recommending Program A instead of Program B because of a racial equity concern. I think, they've gotten more comfortable over time just having the practice in doing that and going through that year after year.
And I have a question. So now, 4 years later, do people feel like they're the right people?
I think they do. I don't want to claim total success, because I still think there's so much room for growth, in all of us in terms of how we apply this. But I don't get the questions anymore about why are we doing it. And, there's a lot of turnover in budget offices. And so what's really interesting is that the pushback I got a few years ago when we added it were from people who had been around a long time. It was new. It was different. Now people, when they get hired in, these review criteria, this is part of their onboarding. There's not a question, right, of should we do this or should we not. It's, hey, look at these 12 criteria. They're all really important. And when they read the analyses that other people are already doing in the office that are incorporating equity, I think it becomes more routinized. And so I'm not getting those questions anymore. Now, whether we're doing a good job of it or not, I think that's I might leave for other people to sort of weigh in on. But I don't get that. I don't get that pushback anymore, which I think is a win.
Yeah, and it also seems like like part of it was also being willing to sit with being uncomfortable for a moment. That people had to really realize that process of applying it wasn't easy or seamless, that you did have to be uncomfortable with being like, ooh, this proposal might have a racial impact that I really have to talk about. And that this is part of my job. I think that I just want to call that out because that also sounded interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, and there was, there was an example. I think it was last year's budget where we ranked capital projects based on risk, and there were two paving projects and council only had enough money to fund one of them, and one of the paving projects ranked higher than the other based purely on risk criteria around the asset. The road was sort of disintegrating. But we actually recommended skipping over that project and going to one further down on the list, which was still a project that needed to be done. Because it was in an outlying area of the city, a predominantly minority and immigrant population area that hadn't had a lot of transportation investment over the years. And that was the explicit reason why we were jumping over. And both projects need to be done, but in budget there's always trade-offs. And when it came time to, which one to do first. And so, yeah, that is tough for the analyst to say, all of this risk criteria says we should do Project A, but I'm actually going to recommend Project B. And in that case, council agreed and said, yeah, no, we should make that investment in East Portland, and we'll come back and do the other project, but we'll do it later when we find some additional money. So I think we can, it is tough, but I think that also they get more and more comfortable the more that happens, and the more they see that our city council actually listens to that and takes it into account.
Thanks. Thank you.
In terms of the budget equity assessment tool, a lot of the things Crystal talked about, we have some of those components. Again, it's not as comprehensive as a racial equity tool, and our Office of Equity is I think close or maybe even finished with again a broader ranging racial equity tool, which we'll start applying. But the goal of the budget equity assessment tool was to gauge the equity impact of budget decisions, and specifically around communities of color and people with disabilities. And you can see on this slide, some of the questions that are put out there that are intended to guide city bureaus as they go through this process. And they are supposed to be using this budget equity tool as they develop their budgets. And there are questions in there that focus on their base budget. So it says within your base budget, how have you maximized equity considerations? And then there are also questions about specific requests and whether they're asking for new money for something, or if we're making them go through a budget reduction exercise, really asking that question of how does this addition or this cut impact the goals that are outlined in your Bureau's racial equity plan? How does it impact neighborhoods? Are some disproportionately affected? And then what steps were taken to ensure that there was equitable public participation as you went through this budget development process? As it was with the analysts incorporating equity, the use of this tool has evolved over time and is still really evolving. I think when we first put it out there, bureaus really saw it as just a checkbox to complete for the budget process. There's a whole bunch of stuff that they have to turn in with every requested budget. This was just another form. They filled it out, they checked it off, they sent it in. And the responses we got were pretty surface, and I don't think delved very deep in that first year or so. Over time, the answers have gotten a lot better. There's been, again, some training. So the Office of Equity has reached out to bureaus. They've talked to bureaus. They've done some training about what they're looking for, what they should be thinking about when they're filling this out. I think one of the key changes here in terms of how bureaus saw this was that Dante James, who's our director of the Office of Equity, was given a seat at the table when council was discussing, the mayor and council were discussing specific budget requests. And so by bringing him to the table, that really got bureau's attention. And all of a sudden they knew, wait a minute. And I mean, Dante asked a lot of great questions, but even just his presence, I think, changed the way bureaus thought about this of, wait a minute, okay, this is clearly a high priority of this mayor and council. I better be ready to talk about my equity tool and what we did, as a bureau. And I think we saw a noticeable improvement about the quality and time spent on these tools. Once again, it was clear that there was somebody looking over their shoulder and who was going to ask them tough questions if it seemed like they had fallen short. I think in terms of remaining challenges, and we could maybe talk about these a little bit later if folks have questions, but I think it still is a challenge to get our elected officials to focus on that budget equity tool when they're making their final budget decisions. They focus on it a lot in these budget hearings. I think, there are questions that come out. I think it's safe to say that everyone on our council and our mayor is really committed to equity, the concepts around it and the ideas around it and these these budget equity tools. But when it comes down to the final decision, I can point to some successes, but I can also point to some areas where if it wasn't necessarily convenient, the budget equity tool might have been ignored in that final analysis and decision-making process. And so I think that's going to be a challenge for us moving forward is continuing to get them to use it throughout their entire decision-making process as well. There's a slide here with the budget equity assessment tool, but I think Crystal's going to be posting these tools online afterwards, and so you can sort of see what we've done. And I should note, it has been changed almost every year and improved based on feedback that we've gotten, the Office of Equity's gotten from the bureaus and from council in terms of trying to make it a better tool. The last thing I'll touch on really quickly is budget mapping, and this is something we started doing a few years ago. And the idea was, what would it look like if we asked bureaus to map their spending by neighborhood or by neighborhood coalition, in this case, and what kind of disparities would that illustrate? And so I've included a couple here. It's probably too small for folks to see, but there is a link at the end of this if you want to go on. We have a whole bunch of budget maps we've been doing and trying to improve them year over year. But at first we started by just mapping operating expenses, and even if you can't see the writing on this, you can maybe see the colors. This is parks spending in terms of their operating expenditures, and it shows that and it's broken down per user, right? So we try and calculate per user figure, and you can see that East Portland is one of the lowest in terms of spending. You'll also see Central City is very low as well, but that's mostly a function of the fact that users include daytime populations, so a huge number of people come downtown to work, which keeps the overall cost per user of our downtown parks really low. But when you look out at our more the neighborhoods throughout the city, you can see there was a really clear disparity in terms of spending in different neighborhoods, which was really useful to sort of point out. One of the things, just in terms of moving to the next map, that we realized might be even more useful, spending tells you a story, but level of service, I think, tells an even more interesting story. And this also highlighted that certain areas of the city, the access they had to parks, housing units within 1/2 mile, there was just a really material difference in terms of where you lived and whether you had that access or whether you didn't. And I think there, as a result of these visualizations, I want to, East Portlanders have been complaining about this for 20 years. So these maps are not new to them. They know this. They lived it, but it hadn't been visualized. And I think just the act of visualizing the data in a way that makes it really apparent what's going on has really led to some pretty significant shifts in investment. And there have been some large new investments in park services, just in this example, in East Portland as a result of this data and sort of how we've shown it. And I think there's, one of those things that Crystal talked about was how you use data to make sure you're getting results. And I think that when you start doing this geographic mapping, you can also overlay, census tract data to get some racial breakdown within your city as well, to see if that neighborhood breakdown is correlating, with communities of color. And most of the time it is. And then I think that can lead to, again, some, elected officials, they might hear about it, but seeing it tends to make them act with a little bit more urgency around some of these issues.
Andrew, sorry to interrupt. There was one more question since we were on this data, and they were asking how much data did you need to really have available to make analyses, and was it readily available for these decisions, or did you have to create some things?
It was really a combination. So on the spending side, we know how much bureaus spend. I think most cities do. That's really easy. Breaking it down geographically took a little bit of effort. And so what we asked in the parks example, what we asked the Parks Bureau to do was, take their total spending, and they knew how much they spent per park, right? Because they already had their budget broken down that way. So it was really a matter of coding where those parks are and putting them inside neighborhood coalitions. And it gets, not to get too detailed, but some of our larger parks we actually shared because they really didn't belong to one neighborhood coalition because they draw people from all over the city. Others are very, very specific small neighborhood parks. So it did take a little bit of effort on Parks' part to do that and show that. The second map here in terms of level of service, this actually was something that Parks had been mapping for many years. So the data was available and they actually had it. All we really did was just bring it into the budget process, and so gave it a higher profile by, as we're talking about the Parks Bureau budget, making sure this map was in front of our council as we had that conversation.
Thank you.
And then, just to summarize, I think one of the things, and sort of the way Crystal set it up, incorporating equity into your policies and procedures, I think it will have a long-term impact. And maybe I should have added here, even if you're really not ready to be having that conversation. And I think that, not that it's a good idea to jump in completely unaware, and I think Portland had enough of a framework that it allowed us to be successful. But I also, in retrospect, I'm glad we didn't wait until we were completely ready or everyone had been fully trained or whatever. I think that can delay the conversation, and delay fixing some of the inequities. I think there's value in making some of those changes. But again, in terms of the second bullet there, I think it does involve training, it involves discussion, it involves explanation, it involves retraining, coming back to it again, and sort of continuing that process as you go through. I think equity tools, they really do help departments ask the important questions. Again, there's growing pains there as well. But, and maybe if there's time, I don't want to go any further over my time, but if there is time, we can come back to some specific examples of how equity tools have had an impact in Portland in terms of our budget decisions, both how they might have had an impact in the past if they were used and how they are hopefully having an impact now. And then finally with the data, kind of getting back to that question, there is always a cost in terms of collecting and analyzing the data, but I also think that data visualization has gotten so much easier today with new tools and new software than it was just a few years ago, and it's just amazing to me the impact it can have when you put a map in front of somebody or you put a really cool chart in front of somebody that shows the racial inequities that are happening in a city given current policy. It drives the point home, I think, much better than just discussing it. I think when they can really see the data. And then that also allows you to track whether you're having success. And that's obviously the ultimate goal, is to make sure that what we're showing people and these tools and everything, that ultimately we're changing some of the decisions for the better moving forward. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions now or later.
Right. I don't think that there are any questions, although we should be actively seeking out. If we do have questions, we should be actively, when they come up, just writing them in the little chat bubble. I really do appreciate one of the things that you called out, Andrew, that maybe I did not call out enough, and so I'm glad that you're here, is just the whole thing that it is, applying the tool is not just a one-time thing, that it really does, it's just part of how we do things, and it has to be kind of, in order for us to gain momentum, it is something that we have to be doing over and over and over again, and not just, oh, so we have this lovely finished tool product that we can put somewhere and let it go, that it really is a process of using it again and again. And now, Andrew, I am going to take control back from you of the screen. And I am happy to invite Jordan to come on. Jordan, I so hope, and I'm getting the, okay, I was going to say I'm getting the finger that says stretch for just a second longer. Jordan, if you please say yes, please say hello.
Hello.
Oh, yes. Beautiful.
Hi, everyone.
So Jordan is up and ready, and one of the part that really stuck with me from Jordan's experience from the pre-call and what I named it is just how much it's grown a little bit in Madison like a weed, and they've applied it and apply often. Jordan, I am giving you control of the screen. I think you have control now.
Okay.
And I think if you click, you can move forward.
Great.
Is this true?
Let me try that one more time.
Yes.
There we go.
It
okay.
is true.
All right. So, hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today and for your interest in the topic. It's something that, as you can tell, a lot of us feel really strongly and passionately about and have really taken a lot of, I guess, pride in incorporating into our work. And so I am going to talk about some of the work that we've done in the city of Madison, Wisconsin, using racial equity tools, and I will provide a little bit of context first in terms of how our citywide initiative got started and what are some of the main components of it, and some of the specific ways in which racial equity tools have been used, as well as some of the successes and challenges. And we'll try to be additive and not repetitive in terms of some of the things that Andrew just covered, but do want to say that we've learned so much from our peer jurisdictions in the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, and Portland and Seattle are really at the top of that list in terms of where we started looking when we started doing this work. And so with that said, just a little bit of background. The City of Madison Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiative started in 2013, and that was building on really decades of community-driven and also some government-based work on, we weren't necessarily calling it racial equity and social justice at the time, but a lot of work on around race and justice. And so I don't want to insinuate that this work started out of nowhere in 2013, and I'll talk a little bit about what's happened since then. The City of Madison has been a GARE member since 2014, and our work here in the city, in our municipality, is based most strongly in the Department of Civil Rights. Our city's racial equity coordinator sits in the Department of Civil Rights, but it is a citywide initiative, and all 26 departments are involved. I'm in the Public Health Department, and we're a city-county agency and have been involved in both Madison and Dane County's racial equity and social justice initiatives since the beginning. And so really positions us in a way to bring our some of our public health frameworks, but also incorporate the work of other departments too. So we'll move ahead here, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about what's happened in Madison and Dane County in the last few years. And like many other communities, there's just been such a robust dialogue, discussion, some really butting up heads and differences of opinion, but shared and growing awareness that we have to do something about the racialized inequities that exist in our community. And a couple of catalyzing events have happened in the last few years. There was a report done by one of our nonprofit partners, the Wisconsin Council on Children and Families, called Race to Equity. You see that brown square down in the lower left. And that was a baseline report outlining racialized inequities on dozens of different indicators between our African American and white communities, and showing in some cases that we have some of the widest gaps and disparities on a multitude of indicators in the country. And for a community that identifies as liberal and progressive, has been really hard to swallow. And I would say that that's the case mostly for our white community, and our communities of color have, for our communities of color, this has been validating and sort of a validation of what the experiences have been living in Madison and Dane County for decades. And so some other calls to action have been issued from our faith community. So Dr. Reverend Alex G. is a prominent African-American pastor who has spearheaded an initiative or a movement called Justified Anger, and has orchestrated a lot of action and a lot of awareness, and really a multiracial effort to address racialized disparities. So I just want to say that to, again, contextualize it and really illustrate that the City of Madison as a municipality, as a government, is coming to the table as a partner and needs to continue to do that, and understand a lot of this work is going to be driven and led by community stakeholders, and necessarily so, and that we need to understand what our role is, what's our footprint, what are the things that we can control and influence while continuing those strong and robust partnerships. So I will, from here, focus on the city's Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiative. And as we pulled together our interdepartmental team in 2013, we were asked to start to formulate recommendations and actions that the city could take to carry our responsibility and play our role in advancing racial equity in the city. And we started by looking at what other cities were doing. One of our nonprofit partners, the YWCA, the racial justice director from that organization, had been to a conference and had learned about Seattle's use of racial equity tools, and came back to share some of what she had learned with some of our elected officials and department heads, and with our mayor and staff people like me, and was really intriguing, and sort of flipped a switch where some of our elected officials said we need to start doing that. And so a big call to action around our initial charge with pulling together some recommendations was developing racial equity tools so that they could be used in decision making. So these were the big three goal areas that were developed in our initiative starting off. So equity in city operations, talking about things like our customer service, our service provision, our day-to-day operations, our hiring and workforce development. That second category, looking at equity in city policies and budgets. And so I mean big P policy like legislation, and also small P policy, so administrative and organizational policies. And then looking at how we can incorporate thinking and analysis and decision-making around racial equity into our budget. And I will just say we're nowhere near the point where Portland is, particularly around the budget. And what a shining example of how to do that well and how to jump right in. And so I want to give them a lot of credit for that. And then the third area being equity in the community. And so thinking, again, as I said, about our role in partnering and supporting with community-wide and ideally community-driven solutions, and understanding how we can bolster and support that work. So just a little bit about how our work is structured here. We have, as I said, a citywide racial equity coordinator who works in the Department of Civil Rights. And then we have a core team, which involves representation from every department in the city. We have a strategy team, which is sort of our policy and strategy setting body. And then we have 4 action teams, and one of those action teams is our training and tools team that's developed citywide training. And as I think Andrew mentioned, training, and can't emphasize the importance of that. And just reiterating that, you know, if we're going to start asking people to approach their work differently, think about their work differently, use tools that they might not be familiar with, we can't ask people to do something that they feel unprepared and unready for. And so we've really heavily emphasized training as well, and just can't emphasize that enough. So this was the team, also the training and tools team, that was charged with the development of racial equity tools. And I'll just say as a note that this was before the GARE tool was created and available. We weren't trying to just come up with our own tool just for the heck of it. But at the time, there were only a few jurisdictions around the country that we knew of that were using tools, including Seattle and Portland and Multnomah County. And so we pulled a lot of elements from those and a lot of the elements that have already just been discussed. So I won't go too deeply into those, but looking at what data we have available and that's relevant to the issue being discussed, benefits, burdens, unintended consequences, and stakeholder engagement. And on that note, that's
Jordan,
been yes.
Sorry, there was a question and I wanted to go back a little bit to how you began. It seemed like you developed a group of champions, like from that original presentation. And so they want to know, and it seemed like local elected officials were part of that initial group of champions. But the question is, did the local elected officials get trained at the same time as the city departments? And if not, how did that work?
So yes and no. So yes, local champions and elected officials being some of those. So the people who actually asked us as people sitting in departments, specifically Department of Civil Rights and Public Health, to begin pulling together these ideas and these recommendations were the mayor and a couple of our city council members. And so they were absolutely our champions. And then some department heads, mine for sure, in public health and our civil rights director, and a few others were definitely the champions. Did they get trained at the same time? I would say yes and no. So there were some national conferences that we all attended together, some GARE events. We went to the Governing for Racial Equity conference in Portland in the spring of 2014. And then in terms of receiving the local training that our team developed, we did train our entire Common Council, our City Council, which is an elected body of 20 City Council members. And they did actually ask us to do a training with them. That didn't happen until very early this year. So I'd say the training has been incremental, but it has been something that everybody has, I think, taken on pretty seriously.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so just picking up with the idea of stakeholder engagement and how important that is, and it's been a huge part of our work. And so as we were developing our tools, we did a series of community focus groups. So every time we had a draft ready, we would convene a group of our community stakeholders that had kind of been developed as an advisory sounding board for us. And they would sit with the tools and they would look through them, and we would run a hypothetical situation through them, and then they would tear it apart and tell us everything they did and didn't like about it, and then we would go back and adapt it. And so a lot of what's reflected in our tools that has to do with stakeholder engagement and community involvement in our decision making came from that focus group process, and I can't overemphasize that either. So specific questions about what community needs are being met or ignored through our decision-making process, and then also about accountability. So how is our city going to be held accountable to, once the tool is done, then what happens? So, using a tool is great, but if that doesn't change the actual decision that's made, or what happens after the decision that gets made, if it doesn't shift power, if it doesn't put some autonomy and some decision-making power into the hands of those who are going to be impacted by the decision, then it's really not doing what it was intended to do. And so that's been a big part of what we've tried to incorporate into our tools, and also the process that we've built around the use of the tools. So just talking about the kinds of tools that we've come up with. So the comprehensive version of our tool was what we created first, and that's that full set of questions. It's pretty similar to the GARE tool, and that's the one that we try to use and try to encourage people to use when they can. But to the earlier comment about what if you don't have enough time, that was something that came up, and it's real and it's practical, and it happens that sometimes you have to make a decision that's on a fast timeline, or sometimes you have a decision that feels like maybe it's not going to have a huge impact, but you do want to incorporate some thinking about it. So we pared down our tool into just a subset of the questions that are in the comprehensive version. So we call that the fast track version, and we have some guidance around when you should use the comprehensive versus the fast track. And then a tool that's been created a little bit later is our equitable hiring toolkit, and that's specific to hiring and workforce development processes. And that's been in use over about the past year by departments across the city. So some additional detail about what we've done. We have And as a public health practitioner, I don't know if there are other public health people on the phone, but we have evaluation in the brain all the time. How are we evaluating and understanding and improving on what we're doing? We've had some challenges around evaluating and keeping track of the use of the tools. In some ways, that's a good thing because I think, as Crystal said earlier, the use of tools has grown and spread, and we know that departments are using the tools on their own, and they're developing their own processes around them, and have become pretty independent with those. The number of tool uses that have been done between 2014 and 16 that our team has been part of in a technical assistance role or in a leadership role is at least 60. And it's across a variety of different kinds of uses. And I would categorize those in a few different categories. One being internal. So we've supported a lot of departments on their strategic planning and their action planning. So our city clerk's office, our human resources department, my department, the public health department, the fire department, civil rights, have incorporated the tools in their strategic planning and their action planning, and it has actually significantly shifted the focus areas and the ways in which those departments prioritize their work. They've been used in hiring and personnel decisions, and so every department is required to have an affirmative action plan on file, and those are to be updated every 5 years. We've renamed those to equitable workforce plans. Every department within that equitable workforce plan is going to be required to use racial equity tools 3 times this year, and at least one of those has to be on a hiring decision. We've supported the fire department and a number of other departments on promotional decisions, so they were noticing that in their promotions to apparatus engineer, for instance, the people who get to drive the fire trucks, certain people were participating in that process and others weren't, and it was broke down along racial and gender lines. And so they made sure that through the analysis that they were making those opportunities for that promotion to be accessible and available to everyone. We've used applied tools on a number of different processes, city processes like our land use application, the ways in which people can vote early. We have early voting in Wisconsin, which is going on right now, and use of racial equity tools has resulted in a collaboration between our city's library and our city clerk's office, where currently throughout the city of Madison, you can vote early in any library branch across the city. And then application and policies. And so we've looked at everything, even really mundane seeming issues like large item trash pickup, which did have racialized and neighborhood level implications, animal licensing, vehicle idling, issues around homelessness. And then we've also applied the tools and decisions around developments. And so the developments of all sizes and scales. So really including city developments and facilities like a police station and a fire station to privately owned but city-supported developments as well. And so can go into a lot more detail offline if people are interested in using them in any of those particular ways. But the last thing I'll say on this slide is that we're moving toward outcome budgeting, and that's where we hope to align our budget process with our city priorities, which will be reflective of our racial equity and social justice priorities. Have just become part of the Bloomberg What Works Cities initiative to support us in using our data a little bit more efficiently in developing our outcome budgeting model. And let me try to advance my slide here. Here we go. I'm not going to read through this, but this is a best practices guide that we developed a couple of years ago to accompany the use of the tools, because we're doing a lot of education and sort of myth busting, I guess I would say, around what the tools are and are not. And so we talked about how really and this is everything that's already been said, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but talking about some of the successes and challenges about using the tools. As it was mentioned earlier, the growth and the widespread use and the quick uptake of the use of tools has been really beyond our expectations, and I do see the ways in which these questions and this way of thinking has been incorporated into everyday thinking among people at really high levels, and our elected officials and our department heads, and then frontline level staff as well. And so that's been really encouraging to see. I do want to talk about just the idea of transaction versus transformation, because I think on the upside, having tools available gives people something to do, put something concrete in their hands that they can take action on. And I think that's important, but we have to realize the really need for transformation in how we approach this work and how we work to advance racial equity. And I think using the tools isn't enough if it's not accompanied by the structural change that needs to happen and that deep sharing of power and rethinking of what a city government really has or a county government, the role that we play and the way that we do or do not empower community-led decisions. So I think that's a plus and the minus. So really have to continue that idea around transformation, but also acknowledging that lots of transactions can build up toward that transformation when the vision is right. Challenges, there can be politics around the use of racial equity tools. We've had a few instances where we've seen people ask for racial equity analysis in what seems like an effort to slow down or stop a process or a policy that they didn't like. And so we, as the ones who kind of hold the tools and provide the technical assistance around the tools, try to keep that best practice, that sort of reminder of best practices and the ability to say no when asked to do something that's not good practice. And so could say a lot more about that, but I think I'll move on. I think one of the other challenges has been that we've seen is, again, going back to the importance of training and professional development, just the fear of making a mistake. We have to reiterate that it's okay, that we'll all make mistakes. It's part of how we learn, and we've all got a lot to learn in this work. And so really just, supporting people in as has been, I think, a theme of today, and just trying it, stepping in, asking a lot of questions. And then the last thing I'll end with is an example with a decision that involved a park and had really citywide implications. So, and I'll keep this fairly brief, that there was a decision coming up by our Parks Division. We had budgeted an amount of money to install the city's first ever fully accessible park, and so really wanting to invest in recreation and movement opportunities for families and kids with disabilities, and so had chosen a centrally located park called Bingham Park as the location for this new fully accessible park. And it was going to be a big investment. It was going to be built, and again, in a central location in the most racially and economically diverse segment of our city. And that all seemed really good and positive and benefited, potentially everyone. This is a regional park, so it attracts people not just from the immediate proximity, but from around the city. And the only issue with that was that with the installation of the new playground, it was going to require the removal of a smaller playground near some community gardens. And these community gardens are heavily used by some of our immigrant communities, particularly Southeast Asian immigrants, who oftentimes the grandparents will be working in the gardens while their grandchildren played on the playground. So there's this nice kind of intergenerational use of the park. And taking out that playground was going to disrupt that. And unfortunately, the other playground was going to be built all the way over on the other side of the park near a body of water. And the request for the racial equity analysis actually came from a community organization that's housed in that within that immigrant and multiracial community there. And the way that it was approached, that when our team was brought in, was with some history of mistrust and with cynicism, saying, we know that this probably isn't going to change the decision, but we know you have these tools now. We at least want you to use them so that we can hold you accountable to the decision that you've made. And I just will say that through the few months long process that this took, and in partnering with the Parks Division and giving up some control over the process by way of allowing the community organizers to plan the community input sessions and really have their voices heard in different ways, resulted in a different decision where our Parks Division and our Parks Commission and some of our elected officials agreed that that playground needed to stay right where it was, and in fact it needed to be rebuilt because it was nearing the end of its useful life. And so long story short, the accessible playground is going in. They're going to break ground in the spring, and literally tomorrow night is another community meeting where the youth from that community are going to be picking up the new pieces of equipment for that playground to replace the old one near the garden. And didn't seem like maybe a huge decision, maybe seemed like the obvious decision, but for our Parks division, it reflected a major shift in thinking, because now they were thinking, well, if we do this here, we might have to do it everywhere, and we'll run out of resources, and we won't be able to maintain all of our playgrounds. But this really was an equity versus equality decision, saying this neighborhood is not like every other neighborhood in the city, and we don't have to treat every single neighborhood the same. And in fact, the Racial Equity and Social Justice Initiative and the use of tools gave our Parks division cover to be able to make that decision, and gave them backing for that, and then gave really the community ownership over the decision. So I'm going to pause there and see what questions people have, and make sure we have enough time for Seattle.
Thanks. Great. Thank you, Jordan. I mean, there was a lot, and one of the things I wanted to really pull out, because I don't know if I did that, was the way in which it seemed like you were hand in hand with the community, especially using them as the kind of advisory board for developing the tool. Seems like there was a real partnership with the community there that I wanted to pull out, because the way in which the tool is presented, we don't really talk about it like a partnership. And I also like that because it seems like they're also helping you maintain your focus and helping them on the accountability piece. One of the questions that came up, though, was, in my experience, there isn't a lot of room for making mistakes in government, and that the public can be pretty harsh. Did you find that? And could you talk to that with your experience?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true, and I think some of the harshness is well-founded. I mean, I think even in a city like Madison, where we pride ourselves on some pretty inclusive community engagement processes, when we look at, just like Andrew was talking about, our resource allocation and who benefits, we still perpetuate a lot of inequity, and there's still, a huge gap in who participates and who knows how to navigate with government. And so I think the harshness can be pretty well founded. And so I think we need to be able to receive it and maybe look beyond the harshness to what's really being said, and to really be able to hear it, and, to be able to be critical of ourselves and then use it as a platform to improve. And so this was just one experience, this case study, but through that experience, we were able to overcome a lot of that cynicism that was, waiting for us to make a mistake, and to say, okay, actually, maybe this is something a little bit different. So I guess for us, to be able to just hear beyond the harshness and try to develop a little bit of a thick skin and hear what's really being said. But I agree. I think that and sometimes for us, our local media can kind of play into that, because they don't always have the full story too. So just have to, kind of keep your eyes on the big vision and keep working toward that.
Yeah, thank you. It also makes me think about that last slide about the communication, that it's also about how we communicate. And I think that's going to be an interesting question to also go into our next presenter in Seattle on, to really think about as well. And so I am going to thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jordan. And I am going to, if I can, take back control. Does not seem to want me to do that, but I'm going to try to take back control. And okay, and I am going to introduce our final presenter, and this is Patricia Lally. And Seattle is kind of like the birth mother of the GARE work and the racial inequities work. And so I think you all are the furthest out from us. And we're really hoping that with some of this you can help us avoid these pitfalls and let us know kind of what is coming ahead, so we can learn from your experience. Patty, I think that you are unmuted. If you speak to us, we will.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be presenting along with Madison and Portland and the great work that they're doing.
And in a second, I am going to advance you one, and then I'm going to try to give you control. It's just taking a little bit longer than I would like, okay?
Okay, well, in the meantime, let me just give a little context for the City of Seattle's Racial Equity Toolkit. The first version was created in 2008, and the version that you'll see in a moment with the next slide was revised in 2012. And even that version, which is a six-step process, is currently under review by our office. And we're actually conducting our own, so we're doing a toolkit on our toolkit by trying to understand what our stakeholders are thinking and feeling about the use of the toolkit. What are the hurdles that are that people most often struggle by or over? How can we make it more adaptable and more friendly to use? And then just to find ways to advance the use and to deepen the use so that it becomes a more natural part of a department's work. And I often think about the toolkit like the way we used to think about an environmental study. That, you know, when EPA first mandated environmental studies, you know, the outcry was, oh my gosh, we'll never get our work done. We can't afford it. There's no time. We'll never build another bridge. And in fact, years later, we know that when a large project is being conceived, that whole EIS study is incorporated. It's planned for, it's budgeted, it has its own timeline, and it's now a matter of course. It's part of their work. And that's what we are trying to do in the City of Seattle is, you know, the toolkit's been around now for years, but is there really a competent, critical mass of users? And if not, what are we going to do about it? Can I advance now?
Yes, you can. You have control.
So our toolkit is probably not much different than the ones that have been presented even today, that if our steps are just slightly different, it really is a nuance and not a wholesale difference. So this is the toolkit that we are currently using, and like I mentioned, it is under review. One of the City of Seattle also has a budget racial equity impact question. And the challenge there is that when department directors and leadership are preparing their budget papers, there is this question, but there's really no accountability. There's no way for the budget office to ensure that, in fact, that was a comprehensive, thoughtful, truthful answer. And I've seen budget questions with the racial impact answered by NA, like racial equity not applicable here in this case, or yes, we've considered it and it's a good thing. And so we know that the toolkit hasn't always been used at all or hasn't been used effectively. And what we're experiencing now is that community is becoming sophisticated, and they've learned a lot about our racial equity toolkit because we talk a lot about it. We're very proud of it, and the community is strategic and they're savvy, and so now very often they're asking the questions. Well, did you apply the toolkit to this capital improvement or to this policy? How do we know that you've used a racial equity lens to understand what the unintended consequences are? So we're being held accountable not only by our mayor and city council, but by community. So, and I'm trying to switch to the next slide. Okay, there we go. So as we are constantly thinking, how do we make this more effective? How do we make the toolkit a more effective tool for the city. In 2015, we decided to put a little bit more pressure on the use of the toolkit, and we asked the mayor, and the mayor agreed to make it mandatory that every department conduct at least 4 toolkits per year on a policy, on a procedure, a capital improvement, or a project. And it wasn't just that the mayor said, okay, you have to tell me that you've done this at least 4 times, but there's actually a report back component. And so what we did at the Office for Civil Rights is we created a summary sheet, which we then provided to departments, and we said, in concert with the mayor's mandatory use of the toolkit on 4 projects, procedures, or programs, here's a summary sheet to help you capture the high points of your toolkit. That summary sheet then is returned to our office at the completion of a toolkit, and we were able to examine those. And I'll talk a little bit more about the summary sheets and what we did with that information in a moment. And then we also went to City Council and suggested to our leadership there that at the end of each year, each department has traditionally provided a racial equity update. So how has RSJI impacted their department? But we went to council and said, they're doing these toolkits and they're now providing a summary sheet. It would be really great if you followed up with each department and asked them to brief council on their toolkit outcomes. And rather than to do 4 of those toolkits in a sort of fast and sort of superficial briefing, we encourage council to ask departments to really zoom in on 1 or 2 of their toolkits to explain to council what their racial equity goal was, how did they engage with stakeholders and who were their stakeholders, what were the unintended consequences that they identified, and most importantly, how did they change their program or their policy as a result of conducting the toolkit. So this all happened in 2015. I was actually present when some of the department leaders presented to City Council, and it was exciting to see their own excitement about this work. I realized that when leadership becomes more familiar with the toolkit, when they actually begin to see how it has an important role in their department, and when they start having some positive outcomes as a result of using the toolkit, they actually become really excited about this, and then it becomes its own motivation. So that was the good things. That was a wonderful thing to see, and having this requirement by the mayor really created some instant interest in toolkit training, which we do quite a bit of in our city, as you can imagine. So when we received these summary sheets, and we looked at, we had the opportunity to look at every department's summary sheets. And so it gave us a wealth of information about what are some of the stumbling blocks and what keeps us from being effective. And what I've listed here on this slide are some of the hurdles that we found. And the first and foremost is people are not competent users. We say we are. We'd like to think that we are. But in fact, this is not necessarily an intuitive process. This isn't something that we learned as engineers, as project managers. This isn't something that we've had a lot of practice in. And so people are uncomfortable using it because they don't have the expertise. The second problem that we identified is that there's no repercussions for either doing the toolkit poorly or for not doing it at all. sometimes there's repercussions to the city as a whole when community asks the question and our answer is, oops, we didn't do a toolkit on this project. But up until recently, there's been little to force or require departments to conduct toolkits. The other problem that we found was very often our wonderful planners, our project managers, individuals who are held responsible for developing a plan or a project or even a policy, they set out to work and they do their best work, so well intended, and they forget to apply the toolkit at the inception. And we are really working hard to send a message that if you do the toolkit after the inception, after the beginning phase of whatever you're working on, it really isn't a toolkit. Call it something else, because our community has learned what a toolkit is, and we really want to keep that. We want to keep the integrity of the term, the toolkit, so that people know that when we do a toolkit, it started at the very beginning. And so we've had to talk quite a bit about sometimes winding back that reel, which I realize comes comes with some frustration for staff who have been working on a project for quite some time, is when did you engage stakeholders and how did they influence the design or the goals of a policy or even the elements of a policy? Once again, I think I mentioned that with the toolkit that it has 6 steps, and what we found is that we have very eager city staff, and they very often want to go to strategies. Because once they start thinking about the toolkit, they realize that what it's intended to do is to identify unintended consequences. Well, that gets people thinking, and they immediately want to move to strategies to maximize benefits or minimize harm. And the problem with that is they don't know what stakeholders think about the hurdles, and they also haven't heard from stakeholders about potential solutions or potential benefits that they may not have thought of. So we're struggling to keep people to start with a racial equity outcome. And surprisingly enough, although setting the outcome is a very sort of visionary and global moment, we found that, in fact, that very, very first step is sometimes the most challenging for those using the toolkit. And then poor stakeholder engagement. When I started my position in 2014, in January of 2014, to be really perfectly honest with you, my idea of stakeholder engagement was based on my own personal community involvement as a Latina working with community organizations at time to time, and I brought with me that personal experience. But what I did not bring with me and had to grow on the job was, what does inclusive community engagement look like? And what does it really mean to have relationships in place so that when you are doing toolkits, you are not suddenly forced to conjure up a list of potential community leaders or community organizations, but in fact, you have relationships already in place so that you can go to community, particularly those most impacted, and begin to draw their attention and to seek their input on whatever the plan is, whatever the topic is of that toolkit. So we spend a lot of time at OCR, at the Office for Civil Rights, not only growing our own understanding of inclusive community engagement, but trying to help other departments understand what a critical role that is and a vital step of the toolkit. And we often are challenging them to think about community engagement differently than their current or their comfortable model. And that includes relationship building and communication with organizations or leaders that are not necessarily fans of the city or not necessarily excited about a city's proposal or a city's effort in one area or another. It also means how do we sit in community at their meetings and not try to take over that meeting to serve our purpose, but rather how do we use those meetings to build relationships, to show up and to listen to individuals, many who don't have the formal background that we're often very comfortable with. So there's a lot packed into stakeholder engagement, but it is one area where we are on the growing curve. So these were the hurdles that we realized now that we had these summary sheets that we had to begin to focus on what are we going to do about this.
Patricia, we have a question. Just if you could ground the conversation just for clarity's sake in one project or policy where the toolkit identified some sort of racial inequity and then what was done to fix the issue. Yeah. And
yes.
I would also like to know
I'll tell you,
a lot more clarity about the racial equity outcome as well.
Right.
But, yeah.
So I'll tell you a big one and a small one. The big one is that in our city, we are in King County, Seattle. King County has is required to have a juvenile detention center, and where we detain youth when they're in a criminal proceeding or have been convicted of a crime. And this has become a really controversial issue in this area. Particularly by the African American community, who see this as another form of oppression and the lack of criminal justice reform. And so City Council directed the Office for Civil Rights to conduct a toolkit on King County's plan to build a brand new juvenile justice facility. Now, it's kind of an odd directive because that's not under our control, but that was the request. And we did that. As a result of doing that, we identified some and made recommendations. So we had a large stakeholder engagement phase, and we learned better what the obstacles were, and we also began to imagine what some strategies could look like that would minimize harm. One of those was to build a facility where the need to have beds would disappear at some point. In other words, how can we build a facility where the detention area will one day not be needed and it will be used for something else, something more positive? By conducting that toolkit and reporting out on it, a year later, City Council passed a resolution that provided a place for community to be active, but also for the Office for Civil Rights to begin to work on the significant systemic work that will have to occur to have to reach the goal of zero youth detention. And so it started with the toolkit. It started with identifying ways to minimize harm and to maximize benefits. City Council learned about it, read about it, we reported on it, and this was their next step in response to that toolkit and to community pressure as well. So that was a big assignment, and we are currently now heavily involved in advancing that significant systemic overhaul that will have to happen if we're ever to reach zero detention. On a much more discrete matter, we have a new preschool program, and that preschool program requires that teachers have a college degree. At the same time, we had preschools in our community where many of the preschool teachers were from the same community as their students, may speak the same language, may have the same cultural background. And because they did not have a college degree, they were not going to be find a place at a preschool that was receiving funding from the city. So that would have had serious negative consequences. And what the city did instead was they worked with higher ed to imagine what a curriculum would look like. They provided a plan for tuition assistance, and they lengthened the time that a person would need to go through a educational process to attain the qualifications necessary to remain as a preschool teacher, at the same time availing themselves of a college degree. So that's another example of realizing that one of our goals is to have high-quality preschool, but the consequence was dire for some, and then creating a strategy or a set of strategies to eliminate or to minimize that potentially disastrous outcome.
Thank you.
So here's what we're doing. As a result of what we learned, we took the summary sheets that departments provided us, we reviewed them, we analyzed them, and we decided to return to every single department in the city of Seattle, and there's over 20, and we offered them toolkit, department-specific seminars using their prior toolkit summary sheets in order to zero in on problem areas. And because we focus on what the department's work is, we're able to, first, there's naturally more interest when you're talking about a department's own work, but it also made it easier for the users to appreciate and to use the technical advice that they were receiving, because now they had something really concrete to apply it to, their own work. So what we realized was, yes, everybody needs Racial Equity Toolkit Training 101, and we do that all the time and on a scheduled basis. But after that basic foundation, it appears that departments and policy analysts and program managers and all the people who are responsible for moving a policy or procedure or a capital improvement need to have technical advice and consultation that meets their immediate needs and that meets the needs of their own department. So when we started these seminars earlier this year, we thought that each seminar was going to be a one-time seminar. People would come, learn where they were not as successful as they might want to be from the toolkit summary sheets, and we would be off and running. And what we found instead was that departments needed to have more than one seminar, that people needed to first have some basic knowledge, and then we started needing to layer the advice and the technical support so that people had a chance to digest it and practice it. This additional toolkit technical assistance and support has really, we have been forced to reprioritize our work with our RSJI team in order to get all of this done. The need seems to be very high. So I don't think that in our city, where we have close to 12,000 employees, I honestly don't think that even after having years of having the toolkit in existence, and even after lots of training has been done, I do not think that we have reached necessarily a critical mass where that expertise has stabilized, or where people know where they can get help, or where there's a sufficient number of experts or at least competent users within departments. And so that is the real challenge that we're looking at. And we think that the department-specific seminars was a big step in that direction. We are continuing to provide technical assistance and advice and other kinds of support. But the real exciting part of our work, which I'm which I'm not talking about today, but which I'll give you some advance notice of, is that we have created the RSJI, so the Race and Social Justice Initiative, Racial Equity Lab. And that laboratory, which is going to roll out in 2017, is going to have a racial equity toolkit roundtable, but more than a roundtable, it's going to be a place where people come together, departments come and get the assistance they need, learn from their peers, have access to data that they don't have to necessarily go out and look for, because we'll be able to store data and provide data by neighborhoods, by demographic groups for our city. And most importantly, we know that for things like capital improvements, that those are multi-department toolkit endeavors. And there needs to be a place where those individuals from the various departments who are engaged in a capital improvement have a place, a physical place where they come and begin to work on what is by the nature of the project, going to be complicated. So this is a hands-on place. I talk about it sometimes like a place, where when I go do yoga on occasion, they always say this is a practice. Everybody is at a different level, but we're all practicing together. This equity lab is intended to be a citywide incubator for RSJI policy and practice. It's a place where people can meet and begin to work together, where they can learn from someone who's further along, perhaps, where they can receive technical advice, and where they can help staff their toolkits. Because sometimes having participants from other departments makes a toolkit much deeper than it would be if the team was only from the individuals who are assigned to a project. So those are some of the things that we're trying to do to advance the toolkit, and I'm sure we're going to learn more along the way, but this is our most significant effort to ensure that people become able and competent and frequent users of the toolkit.
Thank you, Patricia. One of the things that is really coming up for me from what you said, one of them is that it is not an intuitive process. And
exactly.
we're not trained to do it, and we have to learn. And then I began to think, what we really want, even on the base, even though you've been doing it for so long, it's like what we really want is a PhD. It might take a PhD level. It might take us. We might need to think about a time frame that's like 20, 23 years of really. Come on, that's what it takes. You can't expect to be kindergarten. You start off, right, in kindergarten or preschool. And then really my colleagues are like, oh, no, we can't say that. But I think that, we have to look at it that we're learning from this. And we're going to be learning to do it better and better. But, for the long haul, that we're going to be learning for the long haul. And that while we are learning, that we can be making real changes. Like a detention center that's planned for obsolescence is really, it's like an amazing, it's an amazing idea, and it's real results. So I want to thank you. We are definitely running short on time. There are some people who are on who have some questions, and these questions are ones that we can begin to address. We're not going to have but we're going to talk about the next steps a little bit. So one is I really, really, really want to thank Patricia Lally and Jordan, I'm forgetting people's last names, and Jordan Bingham and Andrew Scott. And I want to honor the work that you've been doing with racial equity, and I thoroughly want to honor your willingness and your generosity in sharing it with us. It has been inspiring, and it's definitely lovely and needed. I think that there has been some calls out for kind of like technical assistance on how to use the toolkit, and can the speakers share completed tools and toolkits. And so we are going to share out. I'm going to the next steps. the toolkits that they are willing to share, they will send to us, and we will share them out. We're going to be sending out later on today a survey about the webinar. It'll be a quick survey. It takes like 3 minutes, and 3 minutes is long because I timed it. So if you spend a lot of time writing in the answers, it's 3 minutes. And when we get the response at the end of that, you'll be linked right to the recording and to the slides. It may take us some of the budget equity, some of the tools I have available to put up right now. I might need to get access to the others, but those will also be made available. In the survey, there is a piece where you can begin to ask, to think about what kind of follow-up you would like to have and that you would like to ask for. And much like this webinar is a response from what people asked and said that they needed, we can begin to design what else happens from what people ask and say that they need. And so we would totally be willing to do that too. There are a couple of more events. So November 1st is a live in-person event. And it's kind of introducing a new cohort to GARE, and there's also a structural racism one-on-one, and so 101, and so the beginning of the training. And then on the second, there is an adaptive leadership workshop that BARHII is also leading, and then there is a typo, and I apologize. And then there is a session on landing your plan, which is also about the toolkit, about using the toolkit. So there is more support and follow-up, and there will also be conversations about best how to do it. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm hoping that people really did use all the times that we sent out to do the questions, to get the questions. If not, you can also send me, and maybe Melanie will type in my email, and I will try to definitely hook you up with the answers and or our glorious speakers. And yeah, I just really want to give tremendous thanks to the presenters for their work, and then to everybody. There were over 100 people on the call, so everybody on the call who is looking to put this in place, where I honor all the work that's being done. And with that, we will sign off. Okay.